Everyone is talking about AI agents these days, with some very smart and influential people like Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, saying that AI agents will be the primary way we interact with computers in the future. And what I wanted to do in this video is talk about how I'm navigating the world of AI agents. I'll show you a simple, practical example of a solution that I built at the company I work for, and we'll also briefly look at a new library released by OpenAI to try to understand how they envision the future of AI agent development on their platform. So let's just start by defining what an agent is. Like many things in the world of artificial intelligence, I think that it's a term that gets thrown around a lot, but is often not clearly defined. And as far as I can tell, agents are just AI systems that can do things. And I stumbled upon this definition from OpenAI that really resonates with me, at least from everything I've seen. They say that agents represent systems that intelligently accomplish tasks, ranging from executing simple workflows to pursuing complex, open-ended objectives. So typically you'll have some sort of LLM that receives a user query, and this LLM will have a different set of tools available to it that it can use. And so if the user is asking something that requires this LLM to use one of the available tools, it can decide to go ahead and use that tool. I think a helpful analogy, or at least something that resonates with me, is trying to think about AI agents as kind of like a symphony, where there's a whole bunch of different instruments that can produce sounds, and then there's a conductor at the front that is deciding which instruments to use. So in my case, at the company I work for, we had a use case where we're inside of Microsoft Teams all day, and we have a bunch of sales agents who are on the phone with clients, and we wanted our sales agents to be able to talk to this bot in Microsoft Teams that could do different things. So one of the things that we needed our bot to be able to do was to extend the payment date of a lead. So we, in our case, had a different CRM where we had all of our clients and leads, etc. And inside of Microsoft Teams, if a sales agent who was talking to this bot was on the phone with a lead and they needed to extend the first payment date of that lead, they could send a request to our bot, and this bot was integrated with our CRM and could take that client information, go into the CRM, and extend the first payment date. Now, in order to complete this action, this bot needed to know some information about the client. In particular, it needed to know two things. It needed to know what the client ID was, and it also needed to know what the new payment date was. And once it had that information from the user interaction, it could go ahead and execute this action. The second thing that we needed to do was basically just to answer general questions about company policies. Our agents were often asking kind of the same questions over and over again, and this took a lot of time out of our manager's schedule because they had to respond to the same questions. So what we did was we built a little knowledge base of frequently asked questions. And if the user, the sales agent in this case, was asking our bot about something that we had inside of our knowledge base, or more generally just a question about company policies, our agent would execute this action here. This is a whole video probably in and of itself about RAG systems, which I will make in the future. But in the context of this agent, this was just another action that our agent could use. And finally, the last thing that our agent did wasn't really an action, but it simply would just respond to the user. So let's say that a sales agent was asking something that wasn't related to a company policy, or they didn't want to extend the payment date of a lead. Maybe they were just messing around with our bot and just having casual conversation. Then if our LLM decided not to use one of these actions, it would just simply kind of respond in natural language to whatever the user was asking. Now let's jump into Cursor, and I want to show you how this works. This is not the actual code that we used, but it is close enough. I've just kind of basically done what we did, just with placeholders here so that you can see how all of this fits together. But before we dive into specific sections of this code, really at a high level, all this code is doing is sending a request to OpenAI, and we're attaching the user query to that request, and also a list of tools that can be called by this AI if it thinks that what the user is asking about can be solved by one of these tools. So the first thing that we're doing here is we have this variable called tools, and we have essentially two different functions. Both of these functions correspond to what I showed you earlier. So one function is for extending the payment date of a client, and another function is for answering general questions. For the extension of a payment date, we have different properties that we need to know in order to be able to run this function. So those properties, like we saw in the previous example, that's the client ID, which is a string, and the new payment date, which is also a string in this format. For this function, answering general questions, we also need to know what question the sales agent is asking. But that's it. Compared to the extend payment date, this is a pretty simple function. So then what we have is these different functions in our code for actually handling, answering general questions, and extending the payment date. Now, in reality, in our case, this was a much bigger function where we would actually, in our case, we actually had like a little Puppeteer script. So we would sign into this CRM that we were using programmatically and go ahead and complete the extension of a payment date. But right now for this example, all I'm doing is just logging to the console that, hey, we're extending the payment date for this client to whatever the new payment date is. But basically how this works for extend payment date and answer general questions is you can kind of think of these as functions that are catching the response almost from our request to OpenAI. So we send the request to OpenAI. If this AI decides that what the user wants to do is extend the payment date, then it's going to respond with a function call. And our job, and we'll see this kind of in the main function here called process message, our job is to basically catch that function call and then do whatever we need to do inside of this code right here. The last thing to talk about here is just this main process message function. Now, again, in our case, this was a Microsoft Teams integration. So we had all of this set up on a backend server, and we would receive a request from Microsoft Teams via an API, and we would process that request and do all of the things that we're doing in this code inside of that backend server. But I just have this main script here that, or this main function rather, that kind of triggers everything so that we can just get responses for this example. So let's look at what this function actually does. The first thing that we're doing, this process message function takes in a user message. So whatever the user is asking about, we're going to send that to OpenAI, right? And we've defined this OpenAI instance right up here, and we're going to make an API request to OpenAI. Now, in this example, we're using the responses API, and this is pretty new from OpenAI. At the time that I was actually building this system, we were using the chat completions API, but they're changing things all the time, and they have a little write-up right now in their documentation about why they are introducing the responses API. It seems kind of similar to the way that chat completions worked. It's just a little bit more robust in terms of the different tools that you can use out of the box. I think it's kind of replacing the assistance API, which was a little bit clunky, in my opinion, to use. But it's quite similar to the chat completions API. I just kind of used responses here because that seems to be the new API that they're going to build out going forward. But it works the same way. So we're taking this user message and we're sending an API request to OpenAI. We're passing in that input, and then we're passing in our list of tools that we defined above here. If this AI decides that it wants to use one of these tools available because the user is asking a question that relates to the use of one of those tools, then the response.output, the first item in there, .type, is going to be equal to function call. And our task in this code right here is to basically parse out exactly what function call this AI has decided to use. And you can see right here, we're saying if the function name is extend payment date, then go ahead and call that extend payment date function. If the function call is answer general questions, then go ahead and call that function answer general questions. So we're basically inside of this code catching a function call response from OpenAI and then executing that code, executing that action right up here inside of these functions or whatever function was called. And then finally, if our AI agent in this part of the code, if our AI agent decides that what the user is asking about is not related to one of the tools that it has available to call, then it's just going to respond with some text and will return that text response. Now, this is a little bit more complicated than that, because if the user, for example, is wanting to extend the payment date for a client, like we said earlier, in order to use this tool, we need to know a few things about this client. We need to know what the client ID is, and we also need to know what the new payment date is going to be. Those are required parameters in order to execute this function, right? So if, for example, the user says, hey, can you extend the payment date for a client? What our AI is going to do is it's going to recognize, yes, you're trying to call this function, you're trying to use this tool, but I need to know a little bit more information before I can do that. And what it's going to do is it's going to respond with a text response that's going to essentially say something like, yeah, I can do that, but I need to know more information first. And it's going to try to collect that information before it calls that function. So that's kind of where you have to take this message history between you and the end user and keep feeding it back into OpenAI in order to provide that full context. So for example, if I just run this code right here, we're going to run this main function called process message, and this is going to be the user's input right here. So let's just say node app.js. Then you can see the AI response here is, yes, I can help with that. Please provide the client's unique ID and the new payment date. Let's change this a little bit. So let's say, can you extend the payment date for client C12345 to this date? So let's save that and run it again. And you can see we're getting a function result here. So if we scroll up to our extend payment date function, you can see we're console.logging, extending payment date for client, and there's that actual response from this call. Similarly, if we go down here and let's just say something like, can you tell me about our company policy for refunds? Let's go ahead and run that again, or let's save it first before we run it. You can see we're calling this other function, and the answer is I would just go to ChatGPT and ask, what is our company policy for refunds? Which is exactly what I've hard-coded right here. So a very simple example of something that I built. Is it an AI agent? As far as I'm concerned, yes. By my definition, if it's an AI system that can intelligently do things. It's not the most complex system, but it takes in a user input, it decides which tool it wants to call, and that is fundamentally what AI agents are, as far as I can tell. So hopefully you can see from this example that you can accomplish quite a bit simply by using the ChatGPT API in this case. There are other providers that you could use, but just by passing in a API request to OpenAI with different tools that the AI has available to it, you can do some pretty cool things. Now, for more complex use cases, there are a number of different libraries and platforms that are being developed to facilitate building AI agents. One of them that I've discovered recently, and I haven't spent too much time looking at this, but enough time that I know I'm quite excited about it, is again from OpenAI, and this is the Agents SDK. Now, this is, at the time of recording this, fairly new. It's, I think, only 1 or 2 weeks old at this point. But essentially what this is it is a library that facilitates a lot of the stuff that we were just looking at in our last example there, and a bunch more. So when you're building these systems, there are a lot of different things that you have to handle, right? One thing that we kind of briefly mentioned before is a chat history between the user and the AI agent. So if the user is going back and forth with this agent and asking multiple different things, you need a way to kind of manage that history and provide that context to these different agents that you're using. You also have maybe guardrails that you want to use, which looks like it's built into this SDK. So if you don't want your agent to do a certain thing, you can use guardrails. Now, typically you could try to do this just with prompting yourself, but it looks like guardrails are kind of built into this SDK, which I think is pretty cool. And finally, handoffs, which I think is kind of the trickiest part, at least in my mind, for building these systems effectively, is deciding when to hand off different tasks to different agents. So if you have multiple agents that you're using and kind of this one master agent at the top that's deciding based on the user query, which agent do I hand this task off to, that can be something that's quite challenging to do, and something that this Agents SDK, at least, again, I haven't played with it too much, but the examples look pretty cool in terms of just how they've approached handing off different tasks to different agents. I'll probably at some point, once I've had a little bit more time to play with this, do another video just on this Agents SDK. But even just going through their GitHub repo and looking at some of the examples for different agents that they've built, I really do like the structure of this, of how they're approaching the problem of building agents. And fundamentally, again, like behind the scenes, all this SDK does is facilitate everything that we were kind of just looking at in that example and a little bit more. At the end of the day, it is just, what does the user want to do? What tools do I have available? And how can I execute doing that thing? There are also a lot of no-code platforms that seem to be doing a lot of interesting work in the world of AI agents. One in particular, N8N. I tried N8N, a couple of years ago, and was really impressed by them. I'll likely do another video on them in the future, but I'm seeing a lot of talk about just really powerful systems that you can build without writing code on their platform. So something to be aware of. And there's probably a whole bunch too that I'm not aware of that, if you have experience with different platforms or different libraries that you're really enjoying, let me know in the comments. I'm always trying to keep on top of this stuff, but as I'm sure you can relate, the world of AI moves very, very fast, and it can be tough to keep up. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you're interested in learning how to write code and build your own web applications using AI, I'm working on a course for that. It's not quite ready yet, but the link to join the waitlist is in the description. And yeah, thanks for watching. Let me know what you thought of this video. Let me know if there are any tools that you're using to build AI agents that I didn't mention that you're excited about. I'd love to know more, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.